Good evening. Welcome to Fundamental Freedoms. My name is Steve Burgess, and I am broadcasting from my home in Utah.
I'm David Sabine. I'm broadcasting from my home in Ontario, so long as our government allows us and doesn't use Bill C-10 to shut down our fundamental freedoms.
At Fundamental Freedoms, we believe that good society is based upon good conversation. It is okay to start a conversation, not prepared to do battle. It's okay to change your mind, and it is, of course, okay to have great respect even for those you disagree with.
You can find us at fundamentalfreedoms.org, a website there that links to the various places where we publish our videos at YouTube, Rumble, Facebook. Also, Steve authors articles there, which I just can't say enough about. They're excellent articles. We ask ourselves and our guests to abide by two simple rules. That is that we don't use undefined they statements, and we try to avoid undefined we statements. So if we're using the words they or we try to be specific about who that means or who we're referring to.
Well, we're excited to have Lisa Wardley with us tonight. Let's go ahead and invite her in.
Hello, Lisa. So I should say first that I'm honored to have my sister join us, and we've been trying to get Lisa to join us for a number of months now, and I'm very interested to have this conversation with her. The first thing I'd like to do, Lisa, though, is ask you to perhaps share a bit about your history, your resume, and then we're going to dive into the conversation regarding, fundamentally, how is it that a conservative voice like yours has so much to say about environmental stewardship and the conservation of species in Canada's north? So tell us about yourself, please.
So I'll try and keep it as short as possible. So I have lived in Zama, which is the most northern community in Alberta, for the last 29 years, I guess. Raised a family here. I have been on municipal council as an elected official for the last 17 years with Mackenzie County. And, you know, with that brings a bunch of other things. I'm involved with economic development in the north, tourism in the north, libraries. I'm always a library advocate. I think that comes from my grandmother. And I truly love being a northerner. And I'm going to do a disclaimer right here for all my northern friends, is I realize I'm a near northerner in your eyes, but for everyone else that's probably listening, I am a northerner because they all live south of us. So I guess in general, I've been a northern advocate for, you know, going on 30 years. So I live in kind of the middle of nowhere, and I absolutely love it. And so, yeah, that's kind of, I guess, a little bit about me in, what, a minute or less.
Thank you, Lisa. So the reason that I have invited Lisa to join us, I suppose, started a number of years ago, so I should say first, actually, Steve and I are going to pose a fundamental question to Lisa that will help us to focus and guide our conversation through the evening. And my fundamental question is, what do the activists and government-related environmentalists get wrong about the North? Or not even the North specifically, but species at risk, the conservation of lands, and the preservation of resources in the North. What do they get wrong about that? And the reason I'm asking Lisa this question is that a number of years ago, I know that she was very involved in a group that was, I guess, well, Lisa, how big was the area that the NDP government of Alberta was going to convert into parkland? Just what was the sheer size of that?
Okay, well, let me answer your first question, I think in general, and it's not just activists, it's government bureaucrats, it's kind of everyone who decides on making policy or decisions, is that they forget to talk to the people. They forget that there's people involved in the situation at all, or, you know, that should be part of the solution, or that maybe have the solution. And that's evident over and over and over again. And, that's not just, what you classify the activists, but if you're making decisions for an area that, one, you know very little about, two, you only have seen on a map, three, you maybe can say that you've seen it from an airplane or a chopper ride over the top, or my favorite is that, well, it looks good in computer modeling, you've missed the boat. You need to actually go talk to the people on the landscape, whether that be the people that live there, that work there, but have an invested interest. And that's really what, is completely off. That's like me wanting to pass policy for, the area that in Utah that you live, Steve. I have no idea what's going on in Utah. Why would I have that opinion over you that lives there? Or saying, David, I'm going to make a land use change in your, neck of the woods in London, Ontario. Again, what right do I have to do that? And what decision would I make that would be better than the decision on the people that live there? So that's the first thing. So, and just to be clear, this wasn't all just an NDP government. This issue of caribou range planting across Canada has gone across multiple different political stripes, federally and provincially. Where I got involved with it, and I guess, out of necessity, was first of all, in quite a few years ago, under our previous Conservative government, there was, and under the neighboring jurisdiction in northeast Alberta, the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan was completed. And in that plan, they decided that 171 townships of land in our neck of the woods, in my backyard, just north of here, was or should be proposed conservation area for caribou. The biggest issue that they had there is they forgot to actually ask or talk to any of us before they did that. And we found out when all of a sudden it came out on a map. So that sort of started the process. In 2016, there was an announcement, a draft range plan report for caribou came out. And in 2016, 1.8 million hectares. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what a hectare is about the same size as a rugby field, an international rugby field. So take that rugby field picture and times it by 1.8 million, and you'll get the size of park that the previous government thought would be a great idea. Again, right in our backyard, not talking to anybody that actually worked here, lived here, played here, and, needed that land base to actually either recreate or, put food on their table for their family. Mm-hmm. So in that, NWSAR is what we're called, so Northwest Species at Risk Committee, was originally made up of 6 municipalities here in the north. So there was 3 towns and 3 rural municipalities that make up about 1/5 the land base of the province. So we're a fairly big chunk of real estate, but we don't have a lot of people, which is part of our, challenge at parts, because there isn't, there's like, well, there's not a lot of people up there, so this should be fine, right? So we kind of got together and started to push back. And that's sort of what started a lot of us in a direction that nobody thought we'd be. Me personally, I didn't think, 5-6 years ago that I would know as much about caribou as I do now. And honestly, if I could turn back the clock and not have to know that much and go down that road, I probably would, because it's been exhausting. It's seriously been exhausting.
So I'm gonna take us backwards just a little bit and set the table a little more. I just want a little more context. So you say you live in the middle of nowhere. Well, that can mean a lot of different things. I think you actually live in the middle of nowhere. So where, some people will understand or have some context of Edmonton, one of the farthest north, high population cities in the world. So how far north of Edmonton are you in the province of Alberta?
Zama sits about 8 hours drive time if you drive the speed limit. We're about an hour as the crow flies from the territory's border. So if you actually look at the map and you see the 60th parallel, we're about an hour south of there, and we're about an hour as the crow flies east of the BC border. So we are, right in that very northwest corner of the province of Alberta. And we are surrounded by boreal forest and, a lot of muskeg and swamp and that kind of thing. And our nearest community to us would be the town of High Level, which is about an hour and a half. It's about 165 kilometers kind of southeast of us.
And
so, yeah.
and to get And that metropolis of high level has how many people?
Just under 4,000 people.
Okay. All right.
In the metropolis.
So, and
Hold on.
the other
There's
thing
been
I
a couple
thought
of numbers here. I just want to put in context the size of this area that she's talking about. So Lisa said 20% of the land area of Alberta. Okay.
Yeah.
1.8 million hectares. Now let's put that into something that people can wrap their brains around, like kilometers. Like how many square kilometers is that?
Oh, I don't know. Someone get a calculator. Someone can do that online. Like I said, it's about, I don't know. It's big. It's about the size of an Atlantic province. Because if you look at our region specifically, the north, so the municipality that I live in is about the size of New Brunswick.
Right.
So that's,
we were,
you know, and then just wait,
Steve,
Dave, and then you add the other two municipalities, the big two rural municipalities that are partners in this NWSAR kind of region, and it's another, you know, maybe PEI. So it's like two Atlantic provinces in kind of the northwest corner here. So it is
Steve and I did a little math before our conversation here, and we figured it was about the size. It was roughly the size of Connecticut, New Hampshire. Steve, help me out. Maryland, Massachusetts.
Massachusetts and Vermont.
Vermont. That's what. So Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont all together. So it's a few New England states that the government thought was a good idea to just like what was their response like to questions such as, what do you do with all the people that live there?
Well, see, that's the issue, is that where the park was actually going to be, there is no people that actually live in that park area, which, you know, again, in their mind, it's like, well, no one lives there. So, you know, you don't really need it. We can, you know, draw a line around it and turn it into a big old conservation area, which we have already. You know, we have in our region, just to the west of us, we have Wood Buffalo National Park, which is the largest national park in Canada. We have the Caribou Mountains Wildland Park, which is the largest provincial wildland park in the province of Alberta. Just south of us, we have the Hayes-Amok Wildland Park, another substantial, you know, parkland. A little bit further south than that, we have the Chinchaga Wildland Park. And what's different about wildland parks, and of course, the frustrating part is if you stand in downtown, I'm going to use our big metropolis to the south of us, Edmonton, or, you know, if you go out your front door, David, and ask your neighbor, you know, what would the world be better with more parks in it? And of course, they're going to say, yes, that would be wonderful. It'd be great to have more parks. But a lot of people view parks as Jasper, Banff, Yellowstone, you know, kind of those ones where you can go skiing, you can go hiking, you can camp, you can, you know, recreate. They don't view parks as, you know, basically sterilized land masses that, you know, realistically a few people can get to. There's not necessarily not roads to them. A few people can get there. And realistically, the only thing that ravages across a wildland park in the northwest corner of Alberta is fire. So unless we're actually managing that land base, you know, we're losing that land to fire anyways, because that's pretty much what happens. So we have the Caribou Mountain Wildland Park that was created, and I'm probably going to get a text message because I'm going to screw up the dates, but close to 20 years ago. And we are still waiting for a recreation master plan to come out of that wildland park in order to look at and say, okay, how can the locals of this region actually utilize that land to recreate? We're not talking about turning it into the next Jasper or the next Banff. We're talking about being able to take our families to do some backpacking, some camping, be able to access some of the lakes and, you know, maybe go fishing. You know, that's not even a possibility. So when you talk parks in our neck of the woods compared to parks in an urban setting, it is two completely different definitions. And, you know, that's what people, you know, heard. All of a sudden we're going to, you know, 1.8 million hectares into a park. And we're like, oh, great, you're going to sterilize another 1.8 million hectares of land in our area that, you know, we utilize for social or for socioeconomic. So, you know, there's oil and gas on the landscape. There's forestry on the landscape. Bistu Lake is up there. You know, there used to be commercial fishing at a smaller scale. You know, recreate as far as quadding and that kind of thing. But again, we're talking at a completely, like there's 30,000 people that live in this whole entire region, the size of how many states did you say? Named them off, like 5?
About 4 New England states, yeah.
About 4 New England states. There's about 30,000 people. So we're not talking about, you know, what is there, 30,000 people in a couple weekends in Banff? You know, yeah. So all things relative. We've done some pretty good things up here, and we've learned as well. But we can't necessarily be the dumping ground for conservation offsets for everywhere else in the province, and we definitely can't be. It's like we're living the sins of the South, right? It's like they didn't do it right down there, so we're not going to do anything up there, and it's frustrating. So that's sort of where. So NWSAR, the group, kind of got together and started to push back. We realized that this was just, it wasn't going to be a one-off. It's happened to us multiple times. Caribou Mountain Wildland Park was one example of that. And it's kind of like, okay, well, how much land are we going to have left after they're done with us? So the municipalities are a good fit for that, because basically we're just locals. It's the closest level of government to the people. We have connection to the people because we live in these communities. We understand what happens. We understand that it's our residents that are driving log truck, or that are working on a service rig, or that are fishing in the area, or want to be able to take their family out and quad for the weekend and that kind of thing. But it's also our residents that want to ensure that there's a moose population, that there is, our Hazama wild bison herd, which is a protected bison herd, which is the only disease-free bison herd in northern Alberta. And, those kind of things we want to be able to protect. We want to be able to, proudly say that we have, wolves on the landscape, or wolverines, which again are, sort of a protected species as well. So all of that, the reason why we live here is because we have wildlife in like right in the backyard. And I know David can attest to it. The Hazama bison herd is a fairly big resident in the community of Zama. Anyone doesn't believe me, they can come up and, pooper scoop in my yard, because it's like they, I don't necessarily need to, and everyone's going to be laughing going, oh, that can't be that big of a thing. But it is. I'll tell you, sorry, it's a sidetrack a little bit. But so last fall, I had family that came up, and it's a little funny story, but family that came up and helped me tin my roof. So my nephew decided that, he wanted to make a little bit of money. He's too young to really get on the roof. So it's like, Auntie, what do you have for me to do? And I said, well, you know what? I really need you to poop or scoop all that bison patties up in my yard. Okay, so him and my youngest daughter got, the steel shovel and the wheelbarrow, and away they went, and cost me $47. And it was like, that's what he made, pooper scoop and bison patties out of my yard. So when I say we have wildlife and basically a protected species like that in our backyard, we like literally have it in our backyard. So if someone's going to come to me and say, well, you know what, you don't know anything about Hazama bison, and I'm going to go, well, I kind of do, So, so anyways, back to how we did this. So we had the 5 or 6 municipalities that kind of got together. So we ended up pushing back a little bit. So there's 5 municipalities, 11 associates. And again, it takes up a fairly large percentage of the northern province. And we started pushing back. And of course, we weren't about to, kind of light the dumpster on fire. It was like, no, you know what, let's do this respectfully. Let's try and educate and say, this is why, we don't agree with what you're doing. And so we went out and we did public information sessions across the region. And it happened to be, minus 40 the week that we did it. And even that, the amount of turnout that we had at these public sessions, where we tried to say, okay, this is what's happening, this is what's going on. Tell us what you think. You guys work there, you live there, you play there. What's happening on the landscape that we need to be able to put in a format that we can actually educate these, the government bureaucrats, the government in general, and some of the groups that were pushing this. So we did that. And in 2017, we actually released a report that had a bunch of different recommendations on them, or in it. And kind of the 4 major recommendations of that were, 1, no more parks. If you want to have land that is, priority to wildlife or priority to, kind of lower level development, that's fine. But we still need to be able to manage that landscape. Everyone wanted to be able to see, okay, if it's between logging and fire, you know what, let's actually sustainably harvest and sustainably log so that, those trees are actually used instead of just going up in smoke. If you actually look at the land base up here, we had some pretty extensive fires. So that is it's an extreme risk, not just to the communities, but to infrastructure, but also to wildlife, the biodiversity of the actual land in general. So that was one of them. biggest other one was make sure the locals are involved. Come talk to us. Go talk to the people that are actually out there on the land base, the trappers, the hunters, the people that actually live there, our First Nations communities. Go talk to them, not, that higher level echelons. Go talk to the people and find out what actually makes sense. If the goal is to get 65% undisturbed land base, go talk to them and see how we can get that done. So that was another one. Multi-species was a big one, is that you can't do a land use plan and only look at caribou. It's like putting blinders on and saying everything we do is going to be in the best interest of caribou, regardless of anything else. And that was a big one for us, because if you look at caribou planning, and in BC, southern Alberta, I want to say southern Alberta, still northern Alberta, but south of here, areas in northern Ontario, northern Quebec, kind of across Canada, alternate prey and predator management are two kind of topics that people bring up. And alternate prey management means removing moose, bison, deer, elk, anything else basically off the landscape so that it reduces the population of predators. And for us up here, if you actually look at, kind of the culturally sensitive animals, it's the moose. Moose is kind of the lifeblood of, a lot of our First Nations and a lot of our, regular residents as well. So when you start talking about the only way we're going to be able to save caribou is if we actually remove other species off the landscape, whether that be predators or whether that be or alternate prey, or whether that be predators like on a large scale wolf cull, removing bears, wolverines, all of that kind of thing off the landscape. It's kind of, again, really, like, does that actually make sense for kind of the bigger scheme of things? So again, but if you only look at caribou, that's what it looks like. If the ultimate goal is to increase caribou herds at all costs, you know what, you can do that. But what's the actual cost on the fallout? So multi-species was a big one for us on that one. Socioeconomic. Nowhere in sort of the original planning was there any kind of mention to what that would do to the socioeconomic viability of communities, municipalities, small business, even quality of life. When you take and restrict land use to the point where they were going to do that, it seriously affects, kind of everything around it. And again, it's easy to do that on a, I can draw it up and do a computer model, which honest to God, I get a headache in the back of my head as soon as I hear the two words put together, computer modeling. And, from an office in Ottawa or an office in Edmonton, and say, you know what, this is fine, this is the way we'll do it, without any sort of check back in with the communities, the businesses, the municipalities that are going to have to, live through that fallout. So socioeconomic was another one. And then a couple different recommendations on balanced landscape, because we honestly think up here that we can do it. Give us the target and let us actually do it. But in respects to that is that we need, all of our communities are a little bit of forestry, a little bit of oil and gas, a little bit of agriculture, a little bit of kind of off the grid living, as far as hunting and recreational hunting and, that kind of thing. So we kind of need a little bit of all of that. Well, you can't have a little bit of all of that when you remove the access to the land base. We are not an urban area that, lives within their confines. So, everything, if you commute from downtown to a suburb, to go to work, you're good. Well, in some of our regions, the commute is up to 3 hours, round trip. So, all of our industries up here are land-based. And, our way of life in general is land-based. We are connected to the land. And realistically, and I can challenge this, but if you call a community home, it doesn't matter if you're there, if you've been there for a year, or if you've been there for 100 years, or you've been there for 1,000 years, or 3 generations, or 1 generation. If you are truly connected to that place that you call home, and it doesn't matter if it's in Utah or in Ontario or in Timbuktu or in Northwest Alberta, if you call it home, you're connected. So, those individuals that say they're connected to this land base or connected to these communities, they need to have a voice. So that was sort of the fundamental reason why a lot of us lost sleep. We cried a lot. We drove a lot. We drank a lot of coffee, maybe, or, not had Baileys in it. But, we kind of went down that road to be able to say, what, this is what we have to do. This isn't what we signed up for, but this is what we have to do in order to ensure that our region is heard, that our region is included, and that our region is looked after. So we did that. We included, we had a 9,400, just over 9,400 signatures on petitions across the board, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when you look at our actual population, which is about 30,000, and a fairly substantial portion of that is under the age of 18, that's over 50. It was over 50% of our over 18 population. I challenge that there isn't a lot of other, sort of initiatives that get 50% participation in it. And that tells you that, the people actually were connected to the reasons why we were doing that. We had 8,500 postcards that were sent to the Ledge in Edmonton. We had multiple open houses when the province came out and did their community engagement. Or public engagement, which is another two words that make me cringe every time when the government say we're going to complete public engagement. We had 1,300 people in high level at the public engagement session, which, like I said earlier, is the population of high level is 4,000. So again, when you get 1,300 people, we had buses come in from Clear Hills County, from Lacrete, from Manning, and areas to the south of us. So finally, in March of 2018, the government backed up and said, what, we'll just, we're maybe doing this a little bit wrong. Let's just take a break. We'll hold off. And so since 2018, we've been sort of, kind of working through, a different way to plan, basically. So in fall of 2000, so then there was an election change. We went from an NDP government to a Conservative government. And,
Lise,
yep. Sorry, am I talking too fast?
Well, you are talking fast, yes. And there's a lot of information there, so it might be a good time just to put a pin in that, because I want to get back to like this change that has occurred as of roughly 2018 and a new government that you're now interacting with. But let's just put a pin in that and reflect on what we've just heard.
Okay.
Whew, it is a lot. So Steve,
it is a lot.
Jump in.
So one thing I just wanted to mention is, so caribou, a lot of people aren't familiar with that term the further south you get. So caribou are reindeer. So caribou, North America, commonly they're referred to as as caribou. Europe, northern Russia, you would call them reindeer.
Okay,
But it's the same exact species, correct?
No, you just sent a bunch of biologists into like a,
really?
tick there. Yeah.
Okay.
So, no, they're not the same. They're slightly different. In some respects, depends who you talk to, that, reindeer are domesticated caribou, but they've changed their genetics a little bit. They're different subspecies of an overall species. I've probably sent a bunch of biologists into a fit right now saying that as well, but no, they're different. But
can I ask
generalized, if you talk, to be able to have kind of the layman talk about it, yes, it's Santa's reindeer. That's sort of like, they look remarkably similar.
Why are these animals endangered? Like in 60 seconds or less, why is this species at risk? What pressures have been upon this particular species that we have governments that think they need to save them?
And just if I can even identify that a little more, because I'm sitting down here, 2,000 miles south of you, and saying, okay, you're talking about all this landmass that's in your particular political area, but then just north of you, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of square miles or kilometers of additional land where there's hardly any people. And so what's wrong with the caribou? Don't they have plenty of space to go find a place to be?
One would think, right? So in my mind, now this is my personal opinion, this is not NWSAR, it's not a they, it's a me, right? If you look at the species of caribou, then there's a bunch of subspecies. So there's the barren land, there's wood, there's mountain. They broke it down to the point where there's all these subspecies and all these little subspecies herds, right? So in our area we have wood. North of us, they have the barren land caribou, which, you see in the movies and all the rest of it, have all these, thousands of caribou running through like tundra and that kind of thing. It's actually shown, and it was actually in a federal report, that there are more caribou in Canada than moose and elk combined. But once you drop it all down to all these little subspecies and these little, kind of one-off herds, right? There isn't. So in general, it's probably a bunch of different things, and climate change or climate shift, as some of our forestry guys say, is one of probably one of the reasons. Genetics might be another one. That's come up in some of the studies as well. And I'm just going to do a footnote here: is that if you want to understand caribou biology or like the threats or the fixes or whatever else, good luck, because it doesn't matter. You could have 4 different scientists that did 4 different reports. Fire is one of them. The effects of forest fires on caribou. There is competing information. There's, some that say this. There's some that say the opposite. It's really sort of a mixed bag. So it depends on who you're actually sitting in the room with. So for us up here, again, the kind of the locals, you can still, there's, a large portion of the population that can still hunt caribou, which is like one thing. There is, kind of the climate shift is probably another one.
I'm going to step in because that's an important detail right there. That you said a significant portion of the population can hunt this species, and I believe that's because they have treaty status, or they. And you didn't explain earlier whether this land area includes or borders on reserve land. Can you clarify that?
So actually we have a substantial, we have 4 separate bands in our region. And actually that's just Mackenzie region because there's more to the south. So there's a substantial population of on-reserve and off-reserve First Nations. There's also a fairly substantial Métis population up here as well. And then of course right across the border, again, within the NWT. Northern border, yeah, into the NWT. So one of the factors within the NWT, the Northwest Territories Caribou Plan, is to protect the right to hunt. So, in one respects for us, our caribou herds in our northwest corner are all transboundary. So they go from Alberta to NWT, the same herd. And so what, our questions were there is, okay, whatever you do on our side of the border is definitely going to be affected for when those caribou, shift over to the north side or go for a walk. And, so we can do whatever we want to protect this herd or protect these animals. But if they walk across that invisible line on the ground that is classified as the north, the north of 60, if they walk north of 60, they could very well end up, in a freezer somewhere, which, is totally the right of the NWT government and the NWT people to say that, that's our lifeblood. That's one of the ways that we actually, survive, or, that's our right. So, but that needs to be worked into the conversation, which even now, today, that's not necessarily worked into the conversation.
Because the current it's a provincial matter and it's not looked at federally, correct?
Well, sort of, because it is worked out it is looked at federally. It's the federal species at risk legislation that's driving all of this. Although there really isn't a federal sort of mirrored approach across of it, which is good in a way and is bad in a way as well, right? So the province of Alberta has jurisdiction over the province of Alberta and the lands that lie within that. Federal land, and that includes federal reserve land, is not included in that sort of equation. So there's multiple different reasons. Footprint on the landscape is definitely, one of the issues when it comes to caribou. Isn't because they don't like to be there. It's because the predators can move faster on roadways and cleared ways and whatever. I don't know if you've ever actually seen a caribou run, but you've seen a rabbit run. Yeah. You know how you catch a rabbit or a deer in the headlight kind of look, and they're kind of all over the place. That's sort of what a caribou does. They're not real quick on the uptake, so in some respects, I guess, have they adapted like other animals have? Not really. And so they do require a little bit more care and a little bit more sort of help to get over the hump. But how much help do you give a species that's kind of not looking after themselves either? So it's sort of a toss-up on that whole thing. So I think for me, living up, yeah.
There's a point there that I want to dig into. Because that last comment, someone could run with that as a soundbite and say, oh, she doesn't care about this species. But actually, one of the things that shocked me into reality around this issue when I was learning about this from you a few years ago was the notion that, okay, so let me put it this way, that there are people throughout the world, and particularly in this country, that would like nothing more than to stop all industry on the forestry and the oil and gas in northern Alberta. They would like to have that whole area designated as a preserve for animals. Move all the people out of there back to the to the cities. Like, do you really have to live up in Zama? Can't you just be happy in Edmonton and get a job in Edmonton? And I'm trying to be somewhat facetious, but I have had conversation with people who take a really extreme approach, even to people's choice to live in a rural area. Like, should that be allowed anymore? This group of people may also advocate for, on behalf of or in solidarity with First Nations, thinking that, oh, of course the First Nations people want the caribou saved, and so let's make sure our government helps save this species, and so on. And yet, please set us straight on this, the First Nations groups that participated or gave feedback in this process that you're talking about, they were aligned with the communities you're talking about, aligned in the sense that we have to take a holistic approach to this. We have to not just think of one species, but many. We have to preserve, our right to hunt and trap and so on. Please elaborate on that aspect, the First Nations in particular, that were aligned with the NWSAR?
Yeah, NWSAR, yeah. Okay, so...
Can I just say you need a better acronym?
It's like, wait, how do I say that?
You need a more memorable acronym, or I need help.
Okay, so that's kind of a loaded question, and I guess, so let's break it down. So when you first started talking about, so one of the comments you made is about, kind of the push away from rural. And, we've seen that.
One of the first things I said. Okay, carry on.
Okay, so the push away from rural, and we've actually seen that in, kind of across multiple sectors. And if you look at it like, okay, so just the caribou file, it doesn't really seem like it's that big of a deal. But then when you start talking and you look at, and of course, as a municipal representative of a fairly substantial rural, urban, sort of municipality, is that you have the pushback against forestry. You have the pushback against oil and gas. You have the pushback against agriculture. You have the pushback against any of these big, coal mining or pit mining or lithium, brine mining or gravel exploration or any of these land-based industries. You have a pushback. So if you look at it like, kind of those silos, it doesn't really look like it's that big coordinated effort. But if you actually step back and actually look and you start reading into, what some of these groups actually want. And yeah, they want land-based industries off the land base. They want, that whole urbanization. They are pushing, for regionalization for one thing. And governments have done it, out of cost, kind of costing, is even just look at, sort of rural healthcare. Is, you have this more and more regionalization on healthcare where it's, 30 years ago we had, those little rural doctors, kind of in all communities. And then it was like, well, we can't afford to do that, and all these small town hospitals. Then all of a sudden the hospitals sort of, started to, the bigger centers got the hospital and everyone else got health clinics. And now all of a sudden, then we went from like, okay, well, we'll get away from the health clinic with the doctor visits and we'll just put a medic out there. And then all of a sudden it was like, okay, well, you don't get the medic, but you might ambulance service. And so, it's sort of a push to, small town rural Alberta is suffering for that. It's that whole regionalization of school boards, healthcare facilities, services, municipal services, you name it. It's kind of pushing to those larger urban centers. And, that's sort of that same thing where you have the farms are getting bigger. Not necessarily, I don't think, in some respects from necessity. It's just that families are, kind of rethinking, do they want to be closer to better schools? Do they want to be closer to post-secondary? Do they want to be, have a larger hospital within an hour of their home? And that whole kind of mindset. So, again, population sort of shift from rural to urban across the board. What we've seen in the last few years is that's actually reversing now. And specifically, kind of the last year because of COVID and all the rest of it. And the big thing, because you can kind of work from everywhere. I was going to say that we weren't going to talk about COVID, wasn't I? I said that word. But we've now seen that shift that, people are moving back to kind of the rural areas. But as far as the group end of it is that, and I hate to say that sort of blanket, not everyone thinks that way. So within one organization, you have the different thought concepts. You have, kind of that radical end and non-radical end within anything, right? I was a huge supporter at one point in time of one of the organizations that I had to deal with on this file. And now when I actually found out what they actually stood for and where my fundraising money was going to, they will never get a dime from me again, because that's not the public persona that they were actually doing. So then we kind of work into, you mentioned about the First Nations. And again, same thing. It's pretty, it's difficult to just blanket that conversation where it's like, they've tagged into a First Nation sort of community and said, we'll save you or we'll help you or we'll do this and, in your, in the name of, right? And, not all of our First Nations up here think one way or another. It's the same as everyone else, right? There are some of them that are very much land-based. There's some of them that work in the oil and gas industry that are on the same kind of victim receiving end as everyone else, right? So is, again, the land complete, is the land the number one, thing, or the number one, what's the word I'm trying to come up with? Importance to our First Nations in this area? Yeah, it is. And again, even on that end of it, they weren't necessarily, discussed with or involved with, at all those open houses that I talked about, they were a big component to that. Their voices, we were their voice as well, because their voice wasn't being heard either. And, there are, a lot of individuals that even right now don't understand. Like, we're going through public engagement right now on the final draft plan, which, is kind of, it's morphed since that original one, but we're still in caribou planning. And, even right now with COVID and, the difference of public engagement, I've talked to quite a few of the hunters and the trappers that are in my area that are under that, kind of fall under that, First Nation umbrella, which is, maybe a little bit unfair, but, and they don't understand what's going on. They haven't been actually, they haven't seen the plan. They don't understand what the plan means to them. The same as, my neighbor doesn't understand what the plan means to them either. And so how do you actually get a land use plan to the point where the people that are involved or that will be impacted actually understand the consequences? So kind of to back up, in 2019, the new government, the UCP, the United Conservative Government, actually formed a task force. And that was one of the big things that NWSR pushed for was, again, get the right people in the room. Make sure you have the stakeholders in the room to start actually having these conversations on what, land planning and caribou planning and wildlife planning should actually look like. And that was across all sectors. So it was oil and gas, it was forestry, Métis associations, our First Nation partners, municipalities, trappers, I can't remember who else, pipeline girls, I don't know, there's a whole bunch. So we realistically had all the NGOs were there too. So we actually had a really good group of people. There was quite a few hard conversations, which, again, if you're actually doing something right, it's going to be a little bit heated, but you need to get a plan to a point where everyone can live with it, right? So if there's winners or losers, you've missed the boat. So you need to be able to get it to a point where, it's sort of all of the factors are on the table and you can come to a conclusion where everyone can live with it. So there was, out of the task force, there was about 30, I think, recommendations that came out of that. And then this new draft plan was created. I was involved in that process for the last year and a half, and there are some missing pieces within the current plan. It's out for public consultation until the end of May. I think it's May 29th is a deadline. There are some concerning points in it, but again, it's kind of like, the final plan was, maybe it missed the mark on a few things, but it's better than what we kind of started out with. There's going to be, hopefully some tweaks in the plan now that public consultation is sort of, kind of wrapping up, and hopefully they heard, what the actual people again on the receiving end of the plan is going to be like. But even that, and I'm gonna pick them apart here for a minute, and they might or may not listen, but they missed the mark on drafting a plan in a language that my neighbor down here, or, someone who lives in Chateja south of me, or someone that lives in Fort Vermilion can pick up that plan and go, what does this plan mean to me? How is this plan going to affect my ability to live here, to raise a family here, to work here, and, hopefully tuck my great grandkids in? Like they've kind of missed the point on that public engagement, which I hope they turn around a little bit. I hope they can come up with some fact sheets that actually prove that actually show what that sort of impact is going to be to those, to the actual individuals. So is it better? Yes, definitely. Is it still going to require some work? Probably. Is it going to require, some monitoring going into it on the implementation part? Definitely. And I truly hope that the locals are involved in that implementation and that it's not just that top-down approach. So I don't know if I answered your question or not. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Let me just say, I'm really struggling to not interrupt my sister here. Right? Like, never have I sat this long without jumping into an argument with her. So I'm going to pat myself on the back for that.
And lots of our family can attest to that, Dave.
So Lee said a couple of questions. One is, you talked about the caribou have a pretty abysmal sense of borders, and so they wander helter-skelter back and forth over the 60th parallel. And so that necessitates this involvement with the Northwest Territories. Would you, I think I know the answer to this question, but interested to hear your take on it. So when that happens, you say, okay, well, this is no longer a Mackenzie District issue. This is now a little bit of Alberta and a little bit of Northwest Territories. So we need the federal government to come in here and babysit this situation and to provide some oversight, because we've got two different parties. Is that the right approach, or do you just need to drive up to the local officials and that represent that part of Northwest Territories and start those conversations on that level? Is that how much more effective is that than saying we've now crossed borders and so we need to get a bigger government involved?
I must say, we did do a couple trips to the NWT, and again, because it's a provincial and a territorial issue, in my mind, those local conversations are important. That local kind of share of information is important. I don't think that getting the federal government involved would be the necessarily right answer. Although, in saying that, is the territories are a lot more a child of the federal government than most of the provinces are. The governance structure is a little bit different. But it should be between the territorial government and the Alberta provincial government to basically look at those transboundary herds, the same as it should be the provincial government, Alberta and BC, to look at the transboundary herds between Alberta and BC, and at least make sure the plans on both sides of the border complement each other, that they're not completely opposites, that, we'll do whatever we can, utmost, kill everybody off to actually save the caribou on this side of the border, but on the other side of the border, yeah, you can take 2 per family during hunting season. So, it's got to at least complement. And I don't know if that's actually happened, because even in the draft plan that's out now, there's no transboundary mention in the plan itself. So, and it's no different than, if cross-boundary herds are in Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec, because like I said, this caribou strategy is a federal strategy, and all of the provinces and territories are actually kind of in that same boat with, now how do we deal with this?
So let me ask you a second question. If 10 years ago or whatever, when this debacle kind of got instigated, if somebody had walked into this member of parliament's office and said, we've got a real issue with caribou up in northern Alberta and south, part of the Northwest Territories, there's a real concern that we have as a, whatever that stakeholder might have been, maybe an environmental group or whatever. And then that member of parliament gets a plane ticket, flies out to wherever the nearest airport is and takes a snowmobile out to find you and says, you know what, I had this environmental group approach me and there is some real concern here and I wanted to come up and talk to you first, and can we start a process to look into this? How 10 years later, how do you think that would be different Would the caribou be better off right now?
Um, I don't honestly. I don't know, because the frustrating part of this whole thing is the focus isn't on the actual caribou. When you're talking recovery strategy and, kind of that species at risk legislation, the caribou aren't, they're kind of secondary. They're the trigger part, but they're the secondary part. The big ticket number that is in everything is 65% undisturbed habitat. So you take a land base, and that land base needs to be 65% undisturbed, which means, anthropogenic footprint, which is like human footprint. So what we've done on the landscape, whether we've cut a tree down, built a cabin, built a road, did a forestry cut block, or, put a well pad in, our footprint, or fire footprint, which is a big one up here. That's also counted into that. Legacy lines, which have been on the landscape for 50 some years. So it's that 65% undisturbed habitat. Then so say you have a piece of property.
I'm just gonna interrupt you. One thing you said, the word was anthropomorphic.
Anthropogenic. Footprint.
So you're saying that a forest fire is considered, like, they don't want the forest fires going beyond that 35%, and they put that in the same category as human activity?
Yes.
But I mean, most of those forest fires are not necessarily human-caused forest fires.
Correct. So, which is one of the struggle points. So, but it gets worse it gets more complicated than that, I guess. So, say you have a road. Okay, so you have a piece of piece of forest. You have a road in the middle, which is like a 2-lane dirt road, right? We're not talking pavement or anything else. We're talking a dirt road in the middle. What in the the policy around that is, then you have to work in a buffer zone to all of the footprint. So the buffer zone is 500 meters on either side of that road. Okay, 500 meters on either side of that road is a kilometer. So if you actually look at some of the mapping, and you can go on, you can just search caribou, you can search NWSAR, we have the maps on there as well, is you have this footprint that's listed, that's put on the landscape. Then you have the buffer zone on all of the footprint. And yes, according to that, and you look at the map, and it's 94% disturbed. But within this one trail, and then the 1 kilometer on either side, half the time, I can take you out there, you can't even see half of that footprint. Like the original road that was there is, it's overgrown, or you can't see it, but then they've got this buffer zone on either side of it. So it's the buffer zone that's causing a lot of the miscalculation or the misconception that we have, the Bistu Lake or the Bistu Caribou Range is 94% disturbed. So if I tell you that the Bistu Range, Steve, is 94% disturbed, what's picturing in your mind right now?
Oh my! We got to do something about this. We got to rally the activists, and we've got to do some fundraising with David Suzuki, and we've got to do a documentary about it. That's what's coming to my mind, and I think that is what happens.
Mm-hmm. That is exactly
94%. 94% disturbed. 94% of the trees are missing. 94% of the water is polluted. 94, that brings to mind so many misconceptions. Because I grew up in far south of you, but I've been up in that boreal forest area. I mean, it is like, it seems like it's just a never-ending ocean of trees and water. I mean, and to say that a road through that creates a 94% disturbances.
Does that include the seismic lines, Lisa?
That includes that includes the seismic, and of course a lot of it's legacy seismic lines. And even that, back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, when seismic was, kind of prevalent across the province. And it's the same thing in Saskatchewan and across BC as well. Probably Ontario, Quebec, but I'm not as familiar with those areas. But the technology that was used then was you go in, you create a line, and take down some trees, remove some of that sort of top layer of soil, and but that type of seismic hasn't been used for years. We have low impact seismic now. We have new technologies. Some of the 3D seismic take smaller lines, but more of a density. Just because we did something, 50 or 60 years ago doesn't mean we're doing it now.
Like, I've flown over the area in the eastern part of northern Alberta I've flown many times in that area, and from the airplane you can look down and see, like, it's almost like many decades ago, a comb went through parts of the forest. Like, so when Lisa, when she says lines, she's talking about they went through and cut down just enough, like a tiny strip of trees to get a truck through. And along the way, they took seismic measurements along the way. I don't know how they did that, maybe with a little bit of dynamite and a radar. I don't know what that looks like. And then they leave. But these cut lines are like a kilometer apart. So, and they haven't been touched for decades, and so they're half grown back. And like, is the argument, Lisa, that species won't cross those cut lines anymore? Like, what's the argument?
No.
Because if you look at from an aerial view, every kilometer is this tiny little impression in the top, in the tree, what's the word?
In the canopy.
Right? Across the canopy, you can see just like slight evidence that something had disturbed that many decades ago. And so that wipes off a kilometer and another kilometer and another kilometer of land that you would now, or according to the bureaucrats, would say that this is disturbed land. Even though we're literally talking about a 10-foot wide strip that was cut down 50 years ago.
Plus, you got to add the buffer zone on either side of it, so it works out to be a kilometer when the computer modeling goes through and decides to create that map, right?
Yeah, so it's not just the line; it's the entire
entire kilometer. Yeah. So what the lines do, though, is that and roads and that kind of thing is, like I said, it makes it easier. It's kind of like it allows greater clearance for predators to basically catch them, right? Because the wolves can move faster on a kind of a clearing and that kind of thing. But again, if you actually look at some of those cut lines, and I know up here and for years, and I know David, you visited when we were kind of in that, when me and the kids all, we used to snowmobile and clear trails up here for our Pokerelli trails and that kind of thing for under a snowmobile. It was sometimes easier to get off the cut line and get into the trees because the willows weren't as high and, it was easier sort of packing. So, the argument sort of plays as well. But again, as long as, and the footprint, so the definitions around the legislation are, part of the confusing part of it and part of what's making it so difficult to actually manage. Because we, throughout all this time, we still have yet to get a real definition of when the disturbance comes off the landscape, right? So is it 20 years? Is it 30 years? Is it a time frame? Is it when the trees get to be a certain height? So the only thing that we can come up with is when you can't see them from Landsat imagery. And it's like, well, I think if it's a change in texture, you're going to be able to, it's going to look different.
I can look out my window and smile for a satellite picture. Like Landsat these days, like we're talking, 8K photography.
Pretty high resolution, yeah.
Can I, so Lisa.
So I'm going to put it in a context for you. And so I had actually a conversation today and we were talking about this today. And, so there's kind of two different, I'm going to say your living room because I'm looking at your carpet, Steve. So you know how your carpet is one way, and I remember my mom coming in with a vacuum cleaner and you could see the vacuum cleaner marks on there. Okay. So, but the carpet's the same. The carpet is the same, but it's the texture that's changed. So you can actually see that print, right? And then all of a sudden you have where someone walked into it and they walked across it. And then my mom would go crazy because you'd see footprints across her, very newly vacuumed carpet. So, but again, that footprint is there. You can see it, but it hasn't changed. It hasn't damaged really anything. It's like, it's still, the underneath is intact. So, some of the argument is, come out here and get into the bush, see it on a ground level. Stand at that end of that cut line that happens to be on your GPS where it says on the, from the sky it's there, and tell me what you see. There's been repeated reports of, doing reclamation on these lines where they go in and they're pushing over 20-foot trees to plant new trees because that's the line that was identified to be reclaimed. So, there's a bunch of, again, it all comes down to the people on the land. The local individuals need to be included. They need to be a part of the solution, and they need to be part of the implementation, and they need to be a part of the long-term, kind of goal. But that goal needs to be realistic. So there's nowhere in it anywhere. So if all of a sudden, So say we have, just over 300 caribou in our range. If all of a sudden we get to 500 caribou, are we good? Do we get to like have a party and eat cake and, celebrate the success of caribou? No, not really, because if we're not at that 65% undisturbed habitat, you haven't won anything. You haven't been able to celebrate anything. So it's flawed kind of at the start, right?
So what? So you're making the supposition that the 65% undisturbed goal is not primarily about increasing caribou herds or saving caribou. What do you think those proponents, those people who would say, yeah, that absolutely needs to be the goal, what is the reason? Why do they want that 65%, undisturbed status?
I think it's the people off the landscape. Because if that same target, that same criteria was used, that we want 65% of the Greater Toronto Area reclaimed, do you think that'll happen? You think that's a conversation that we're ever going to have?
Right.
Yeah, so this is related to, so this is a federal decision to have 65% of Canada's area, correct? Like because in Prince Edward Island.
Of caribou range.
Oh, of caribou range. Oh.
Mm-hmm. But if you start looking at the mapping on where caribou range is across the country, it's a fairly substantial amount of land, and that land is also the land where our land-based industries are: forestry, oil and gas, mining, agriculture. And
so
it's rolled across multiple species. Yeah.
I'm reminded of a truism, and I forget the author. Someone's going to text message me this answer. So there's two problems that we discuss a lot in my work, which is related to complex systems, such as business. But one problem is that as soon as a measure or metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measurement. Because the second rule related to that is people who are responsible for that target or held accountable to achieve that target will do everything possible to achieve that target, even if it means destroying every other part of the system. We're seeing that with case numbers in COVID. We're seeing that in your story, this 65% undisturbed land. Like they will destroy industry, livelihoods, other species, just to achieve 65% undisturbed land, and use, and it sounds to me, use the caribou species in particular as a, like you say, it's sort of, that's the underhanded strategy. If we save the caribou lands, then we're going to achieve this 65% goal that we have. Tell me if I've mischaracterized that, Lisa, but it sounds like people are willing to ignore most of the most crucial factors in order to achieve this one very specific metric.
No, you pretty much nailed it. And I guess, and we have another, kind of direct example up here is we have the Hayes-Zama bison herd. So wood bison in this country are under the species at risk legislation. They're classified as endangered. So wood bison, the Denatah, just south of here, quite a few years ago, they brought up a small handful herd of wood bison. Purebred, disease-free wood bison. And I keep always saying disease-free because Wood Buffalo National Park has kind of a hybrid bison situation going over there, but they have tuberculosis and brucellosis widespread throughout the herd. So, that's a sort of a sore spot up here anyways. But so our Hayes-Zama bison were brought up by
a sore spot? That's an interesting point.
Okay, well, let's not go there just yet. That can be secondary.
Okay.
Well,
can I just say, I think it's a sore spot because on the eastern part of Alberta, that gets, like the Wood Buffalo National Park is celebrated because of the work they've done to protect that particular species, even though it's the species has tuberculosis and
brucellosis, yeah,
and so forth.
So, well, and part of that is that because it's under federal jurisdiction because it's the federal park, and that was sort of I'm going to quote one of my committee members and fellow councillors. It was he kind of always states that was sort of the province's first kick at sort of species, the species at risk legislation, or the where people got involved, because basically back in the day the province actually knowingly imported diseased bison into Wood Buffalo National Park, and then created a hybrid herd, and that's a long story, but you can Google that story too. But back to the Hazama story. So the Hazama bison, Denatah just south of here, that this is their territory. They brought up, sort of a handful of disease-free, purebred wood bison, and under the sort of the thought process was that they would nurture this herd, it would grow, it would be able to repopulate, they'd figure out what to do with the diseased bison in Wood Buffalo National Park, and eventually this Hazama bison would stay disease-free and it would repopulate the north. It kind of goes hand in hand with just across the border into the territories. There is disease-free, purebred wood bison as well. Between the Wood Buffalo bison and our bison and the Northwest Territories bison, there's basically a kill zone that, in order to protect our disease-free bison, we have to actually hunt them or manage that herd size so that they don't, cross into that territory, get mixed up, bring the disease back, and contaminate and ruin this herd. So why I'm mentioning all this is that over the years, it was always like when we get to a certain number, we'll celebrate, and it started out to be, the Denatah celebrating the success of the Hazama bison herd, and it quickly became, Zama, of course, it's the Hazama bison herd. So Zama and our residents and the people that live in this region as well, we've kind of become extremely connected to that bison herd. We see them in town, they, eat our grass. We have a neighbor here that, was trying to collect fertilizer all winter. It's a whole nother story with a bunch of pictures attached. But, so when that herd got to 400, a population of 400, it was a huge celebration here. We're probably at closer to 600 now on that number. Again, huge celebration. But the success of that herd, and it's listed species at risk, was numbers. To increase the numbers of that herd. It had nothing to do with land base. It had nothing to do with disturbance. It had nothing to do with any of that. It was the number, calf recruitment, how many healthy calves they had, how many of those calves actually, grew to adolescence and then on to adults, and the actual number and the health of that herd. And, so some of the individuals in our area are saying, okay, why are we not actually looking at caribou that way? Further a little bit south, we have grizzly bear population. So again, grizzly bear recovery is based on numbers. So grizzly bears are listed as species at risk. It's based on a number. When we get, grizzly bear populations get to a certain number, there's some celebration that happens to say, what we're doing is actually working. That's an argument in itself, because of what we're doing is actually working. Some cases too well, because the grizzly bears are, kind of taking over a lot of areas, and there's a lot of people saying, okay, we have way too many bears, but that's a whole other story. So we have two species at risk, herds up here, populations up here that work on success on numbers, except caribou. Caribou is it doesn't matter what the numbers are. It doesn't matter how many we can get to. It doesn't matter if we can keep the calves healthy until they can, outrun a wolf on their own. It's all about habitat. So right there, it's like flawed. So when you have an individual that, doesn't read the legislation, they just live here, they, maybe second or third generation, and they're going, well, we have two species that are doing great. We're based on numbers. Why is this one so different? So even just the way that they're looked at as far as recovery, it doesn't make sense to the locals.
Does it strike people as inept or underhanded?
Probably a little bit of both.
Okay.
Probably a little bit of both. But again, and with the grizzly bear, there's, very clear no hunt on the grizzly bear. The bison, the only time that the bison are legally able to be hunted is when they cross Highway 35, because there's that kill zone, so they can do it then. Or that when the population numbers get too high, there's a managed hunt that's put in. So there's so many Indigenous tags and so many recreational tags that go out. And, even our Indigenous population, there's a day that's lined up, and they have to stand in line at the Fish and Wildlife Office in order to get their tag per family. And, again, so it's a tagged out controlled system. So even in that respect, it was important enough for the bison numbers to grow to a point where a legal hunt or a controlled hunt was able to be done. And in between those times, there's a no hunt order on the bison. So if caribou is such a iconic species that we need to, at all measures try and protect, why is there not that process in place to initiate a no hunt on caribou? And I'm talking not even just here, I'm talking Canada wide. Why is that process hasn't been initiated?
Okay, pause and put a pin in that for a minute.
Okay.
You talked about ineptitude versus underhandedness or whatever. So I've got 4 daughters, and so under duress, I was watching the Miss Universe pageant last Sunday, and one of the contestants was talking about the work that she does planting trees, and talked about numbers of trees that she'd planted over a lifetime, et cetera. And I just thought, that's great, and that's a great sentiment, but I go, who really plants trees? Like, if you're talking about, like, who is it on the planet that plants trees like crazy, that really reforests? It's logging companies and paper companies. The people that are taking those trees out of the landscape are the ones, because they have a vested interest to see, 50 years from now, our industry's toast if we don't replant trees. And ideally, we want to replant them at a greater rate than what we're harvesting, and considering fire comes along and wipes out, vast pieces of forest at a time, like, they understand, and if you do the Landsat mapping, I guess, you're going to see that textural difference. Like, well, that's, the trees are growing in rows, and that's not proper, that's not natural, and maybe there's something to that, but I just really identify with what you're talking about, Lisa. This idea. My favorite term, as we've had these discussions on fundamental freedoms, the thing that keeps coming up to me over and over again is levers. It's like when somebody gets elected to whatever office, they feel like all of a sudden they're sitting in this cockpit, and there are gauges telling them how things are going, and there are levers and buttons to push and things to control, and they're like, I can control the country from this cockpit. And so when somebody says the caribou are dying, and somebody else says, we just need more undisturbed habitat for them. Well, how much undisturbed habitat? Maybe 65%. Great. There's a lever right here. I can make a law that says this is our new goal. And that lever gets pulled without stakeholder input, completely independent of all the other factors. Nobody's necessarily looking at all those other gauges and saying, I'm just going to willy-nilly pull this lever and make this change. And it's like, well, that can have all kinds of repercussions on a lot of different aspects, not least of which is the 35,000 people who are living there with a relatively minor environmental impact for generations on that. Mm-hmm. And one could argue a positive environmental impact in that area. So I guess that's just a soapbox. I don't know that's...
Just wait, David. Just wait, David. I got to ask. So the Miss America contestant, how many trees did she say she planted? Do you remember?
I can't remember. It was...
So this is actually... It 2 things you said, and that's why I was kind of smiling, is that, so one of our logging companies, I don't know if I should name them or not, but one of our logging companies to the south of us, a small, multi-generational family one, Boucher Brothers, there was a post on Facebook, because they're very public with their reforestation and that kind of thing, but their tree planting, their spring tree planting just wrapped up. Okay, so the company, the crew posted a target with a hashtag on it that, a proud moment. 780,000 trees were planted this spring for Boucher Brothers. Thanks, Boucher Brothers. We met our 780,000 trees in one spring season. Just one spring season. And that's just one very small, in the big scheme of things, logging company. So when you talk about, who's planting trees and who's not getting the credit for it, it's our forestry companies.
So they're 780,000 trees ahead of Trudeau, who said he would plant 2 billion.
Yeah, I don't know how
Yeah,
he's going to do that, but
yeah.
yeah. And then the other thing you mentioned about the levers, and I know that, if one of my counterparts, the mayor of High Level, who's kind of been along for this ride as well, if she's watching or if she watches it later, she'll probably be doing the same thing. And it's like, exactly, because that was the first exercise when we went into these big group meetings that the province initiated in the province, or in Edmonton quite a few years ago. They got all these people in the room, and then they were going to do this lever exercise, and it was like, please just, pour me a drink and get me out of here now, because again, you're right. It doesn't make any sense to just, let's just throttle this up and move this over here, and, life will be fine, So,
I wanted
sorry,
to pick
David.
up on that. Steve said something. Lisa, I've been sitting here listening to you, and something just doesn't jive. I know you're a conservative. I mean, you ran to be a candidate in the Conservative Party, and like people listening to stories about species conservation or land conservation, they know that conservatives are just all about industry, and they just want to destroy as much land as fast as they possibly can to turn that land into money, right? And yet I'm sitting here listening to you, and you've not said anything of the sort. And so somewhere in there, I realized a few years ago that people misunderstand both the conservative view of environmental stewardship, but also the local view. So you've talked a lot about the local view and how it is that if you're connected to this land, you feel about, you want this land to succeed, you want the species on it to succeed, and you're close to it, so you understand the dynamics between these levers that politicians are likely to pull or push. But could you, I don't know how to turn the conversation a bit, rather than talk specifically about the local perspective, I'd like to know more about the conservative perspective. How is it that you as a conservative are able to talk about this issue with obvious empathy for the species, and you don't sound like an evil capitalist?
Well, I guess because I'm not an evil capitalist. I don't know. I don't think maybe there is some. Maybe there is some conservatives out there that are that evil capitalist side. The same way as that there's some on the other side of the spectrum that are kind of that far left or whatever.
Well, there are oligarchs everywhere, like right across
on both sides
the spectrum.
But I guess my view though is it's not land management and balanced working landscapes and taking care of animals and taking care of species and protecting the land base for the next generation. I don't think it should be political, and maybe that's the problem. Maybe that's what's gotten in the way of actually doing what's right, is because it was a Liberal government that maybe looked at the species at risk legislation federally. It was a Conservative government that was in for a couple terms that never fixed it. We now have back to a Liberal government that's not looking at it again. We've had you look at provincially, like across Canada, there's multiple different stripes in provincial provincial government end that are looking at things differently, and maybe that's the problem. Maybe we actually just need to get back and go, okay, what's right? We need to have jobs, and we need to have, kind of that social end. We need to have a healthy land base. We need to be able to access that land base, everything in moderation. And maybe that's what we're actually missing, is because if you sit in that room and, I've sat on both sides. I've sat in the room with an NDP provincial government, and I've sat in the room with a provincial Conservative government. And, the bureaucrats on that level really haven't changed, but kind of that higher echelons has. And it's really kind of, if you get the politics out of the question, we might actually get somewhere. So, to say that I'm a conservative, yes, I am. To, again, steal a quote from a friend of mine, maybe I'm a conservative with a socialist heart, because do I truly believe, I believe in social programs. I believe in, looking after the most vulnerable. I believe all of that, but you need to have the funding and the money to be able to do that. And if you don't have this part, if you don't have the funding and the money and the budget and, the boosted economy and, sort of that ball rolling, you can't really roll this ball over here. So it's a matter of balance. And I guess for me, for this, on this whole file and moving through NWSAR and even some of the work that we're doing now, because we've moved out of the advocacy part and the lobbying part and more into like the data gathering and the partnership part. We have a multi-year project going with the Alberta Trappers Association for cameras and audio recording units across, 2 of our ranges. But again, it's like, get the politics out of the way and just do what's right. That's it. And again, if you can get all the people in the room and talk it out and be honest and, have those hard conversations about, conservation lands or no-go zones or, areas that are, more prime for development, more areas that are more, one of the questions we always ask, and we still have yet to get the answer, and they should have it because they're supposed to have all these caribou collared, but where are the lands that, do caribou go back to certain lands all the time to calve? Where are prime calving areas? Prime calving areas should be protected. They should not have, a road going through them. It should not have a, industrial development or a gravel pit or a pit mine or whatever else. That should be the highest rating on that land, is if they go back to the same place to calve every time. Is there, measures that you can put in place with a local guardian program or, things like that? And they've done this in other areas where they do some wolf management within a certain time frame, in a certain time of year, during calving time in that area, in order to give those calves a better chance. Because let's face it, have you ever seen a caribou calf? It's kind of like lunch. If I was a wolf, I'm tracking down that, little fat mother there. And as soon as she drops that calf, that's like lunch for me. They've done, studies in, kind of the north of here, in northern BC and the Yukon area on grizzly bears. They put cameras on grizzly bears and they watched, or on bears in general, and they watched, kind of what they ate. Bears take out a heck of a lot of caribou calves, but they're not the big evil villain like the wolves are. So again, it's like, how do you look at an issue? And, because I'm a conservative, does that mean that I don't care about, the next generation? I don't, like that's not who I am. You look at the project, and I know David saw it as well.
I think you meant, you didn't mean to say you don't.
You do care about the next
Oh, I
generation.
do care. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's not, oh yeah, okay. Sorry. Yes, I do care. And I guess, I look at my girls and, both of my girls were involved on a very small scale with one of the local trappers who also happens to be sort of, integrated into family. But, they were out switching out cameras and audio recording units for the NWSAR, research project. My girls are...
I saw pictures of my nieces
Yeah.
this past week out in the forest, replacing batteries in the camera units. And yeah, it was very, very cool.
And so, Lisa, which provincial or federal legislation compels them to be out there on the trapping line switching those batteries?
Neither. It's just because they care. This is their home. They're connected to the land. This is where, this is where they were born. This is where they grew up. This is where they're connected. This is where they see, their kids are going to grow up. And, they actually care about the world around them. They're not, they're not the evil people that are out on the land base, and of course, one of them's in tourism, but the other one, the other one's in oil and gas. She's a safety coordinator for an oil and gas service company, and in her spare time, she was out putting camera batteries and cameras to monitor, wildlife on the landscape. You look at some of the data and some of the projects that have been, across the board. It's not necessarily the NGOs, and it's definitely not the government that's initiating those research projects. It's industry. It's oil and gas. It's forestry. It's, you look at forestry 100-year plans, they have to account for all of that. Oil and gas plans, again, same thing. They're the ones that are putting, and they're also putting money into research and development. They're looking at, the speed of wolves on cut lines. They're looking at different ways of doing things, better ways of doing things. If nothing that is being done now is the same way that we did it 20 years ago or 40 years ago, or even 5 years ago for that matter. Everything's being evolved. There's new technology all of the time. And, industry gets a really big black eye. And if you actually look at who's actually doing the work on the ground, Who's planting the trees? Who's doing the reclamation on, and some of the lines up here, and I'm going to target, but some of those initial legacy seismic lines up here were actually completed by the province. Well, how come the province isn't putting 5 cents, putting their dollars where their, argument is, and how come they've never, done the reclamation on those lines for years, right? So,
Can I?
Yep.
I'd like to find, like, a few years ago, I forget, was it 2012 or 13 when Alberta provincial government changed from a long-standing Conservative government to NDP, and at that time, the NDP ran, as part of its platform, climate change, environmentalism, etc. I don't imagine that Alberta's next election will have such a strong. I don't believe that that'll be as strong an issue in the election, because I think it'll be more about coming out of COVID and economy and so forth. But are there rumblings among the NDP government now and still regarding parklands and converting huge swaths of Alberta into parks? Are they still on that bandwagon, or have they?
I think they probably, they
turned a corner.
Well, might be in the, I don't know if I trust them to say that they've turned a corner. They're just not talking about it, right?
Okay.
And but again, like I said, it was a Conservative government in 2012 out of the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan that first sent out a map of 171 townships across the north, the northwest, based on issues that were coming out of the northeast. But those 171 townships were created as a potential conservation areas under a previous Conservative government. So it really doesn't matter which political stripes are in the provincial, echelons. Is, they'll do it where, they think no one's watching. And I know there's examples after examples of governments botching a, maybe it's a well-laid plan in some respects, but when they don't go talk to the people. Bill 6 was, and I'm going to drag up this one, is completely different. It's, farmland bill. But, when the NDP government first got in power, I think it was their first term, don't quote me, all the years have sort of rolled together, but Rural Municipality Convention, which is the RMA, is all of the rural municipalities across Alberta are a part of this association. We were in Edmonton at convention. So you have all of the rural municipalities in Edmonton, a couple blocks away from the ledge, at their convention. And while we were at RMA, debating municipal, rural issues, the NDP government was sitting there passing Bill 6. And Bill 6 was devastating to our agriculture industry across the province. And not one mention about, hey, you know what? Hey, we're, debating this. We should maybe walk over to the Shaw Center and maybe ask some of those rural councillors what they think about this bill. It didn't, I don't know if it didn't clue into them to actually that they should do that, whether maybe that was on purpose, I'm not really sure. So the municipalities after that, the rural municipalities, again, had to turn onto the defense and push back against a passed bill that was, had a lot of detriments to our agriculture industry. When the Conservatives ran, that was one of their biggest platform things, was to rescind Bill 6. So again, it's not like every government does it. That whole public engagement or going to talk to the people that it affects. At a municipal level, like I said, I've been a municipal councillor for 17 years. And, even public engagement at a municipal level, it's, again, we're better at it, but are we great at, public engagement or letting the public know what municipalities are doing? Not really. There's definitely room for improvement. And I think, you guys, for your city councils and that kind of thing, or whether it's school board or whatever, public engagement seems to be, I don't know if it's scary or if it's a secondary thought, or I'm not sure what the reasoning is. As soon as you have a decision maker that needs to go face up to the people that they're making the decision on, there seems to be that loss of communication. So I don't know.
So that brings me to a good point. Maybe I'll kind of sum up, and this will be my final question to you. But so as you've been engaged politically over the last decade or more, I guess it sounds like, obviously you've got the lavish office that they supply you, the Secret Service protection, the parties that are thrown in your honor, and then the money. My gosh, the money must be incredible. So is it the sacrifice of time? Because except for people like you kind of standing directly in the way, taking the time and making the sacrifice to get informed enough and involved enough in the process to actually throw up a roadblock, or at least a speed bump, when the government starts pulling these levers like crazy. Those things just happen, and then they are very difficult to undo. And so my question to you, kind of in summary, is it worth it? Has it been worth it to you personally to be as involved as you have been, and to sacrifice what you have?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I don't know. I honestly don't know if it's been worth it. Has it been extremely difficult? Yes. And it's not just me. Like I have, there's a group that, all the members of NWSAR, and then even, kind of that extension, because, there's been a lot of people that have been fighting this fight. And, like I said, there was a lot of miles, a lot of coffee, a lot of tears, a lot of stress. My gray roots, I might have covered it up, but, there's a lot. And the only thing that actually made it worth it was because we're not even done yet. Like we still don't have a plan. It's not implemented. We still have the moratoriums on land leases and that kind of thing across all caribou ranges. It's still the mounting, sort of issue. But the only thing that makes it worth it is that, those text messages from the residents, or from, the neighbors, or when you go to an event and you're like, thank God you're doing it, because I just wouldn't have the strength or the know-how to be able to do it. You need anything, let me know. Or, where you get that, sort of pat on the back going, thank God you're fighting it. Or, that little, and I guess probably I see it more because when I drive home from, if I'm gone or whatever, and I drive home, there's a spot on the Zama Road where, if you're going to see caribou in this area and not have to go back in a million miles in the bush, it's going to be there. So when all of a sudden, I'm driving down the Zama Road, and I was actually talking to my mom, who Steve, too, but I was talking to my mom on the phone one day, and I'm driving down the Zama Road, which is not paved. It's like a gravel road that, from Highway 35 into town. And I'm talking to my mom on the road, and all of a sudden I see bison on one side of the road, and I'm like, oh, Mom, I'm trying to take pictures, and I'm talking to her, and I'm like, so I'm getting out of the truck, and I'm looking, and I'm like, pretty good pictures of these bison. And I kind of turned around, and all of a sudden there's like a couple caribou on this side of the road in the bush. And I'm like, Mom, I gotta go. I have to take a video. So I actually had to take a video, because that's like the $1 million shot right there, where on one side of a road that they classified as disturbance, with a mile on either side, I have pictures of one, species at risk that is thriving, and I have another, on this side of the road, I have another species at risk, completely different. And it's like, that is why I live where I do. That's why I fight for what I do. That's what I want to see, where, I want to be able to drag my grandkids down that road and have that same view. And so that's what makes it worth it. I don't know whether, ask me in 10 years if I'm, grayer than I am now and I'm still fighting this fight, I might not think it's worth it. But, people have to do it. And the people that stand up, and it's not an easy job to be a municipal councillor or even a provincial or federal politician, especially in this day and age, where realistically your privacy and your family and everything, like, you're pretty much laid bare every time you turn around. But the people that stand up and put their name forward, even if they don't win the election or, go on to serve or whatever, just putting their name forward to actually do that job is like, they have an amazing courage right there. And it shows that, they care about something bigger than them. And, it's not made for everybody. And no successful public servant does it alone. You have your family, you have your team, you have your sanity crew, whatever you want to call it. And it's the day that it becomes not worth it is the day you need to step down and try something else. So I guess every morning I show up, it's like, yeah, it's still worth it. So. I don't know if that answers your question, Steve.
Well, I just met you tonight. We live, like I said, 2,000 or 3,000 miles apart, and so very little of what you're doing politically affects me directly in my backyard. But I just want to say thank you. I just really applaud the kind of sacrifice that you're making to lay down a bit of a line in the sand, and I just think it's incredible. It's pretty inspiring to me, and I'm just thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
A few things. Maybe a version of success that, like 10 years from now, wouldn't it be great if the caribou species has grown without government overreach growing, right? Like maybe this whole plan that's still delayed and not enacted yet doesn't matter much. That the awareness of the issue has brought a community around the health and well-being of this species and other species. So maybe the caribou are going to be just fine. Second point, wouldn't it be great to have Lisa and Todd Miller in a conversation? He's a this is his career as well, just in a very different part of the world. And the third thing, Lisa, have you got an original of that video that you took with the buffalo on one side and the caribou on the other side? Do you still have the original of that?
I do.
We should we're going to turn it into an NFT and retire.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay. Okay. There we go.
But thank you for being with us. It's been a long and good conversation, an hour and 36. So I don't know if you're... I'm kind of ready to wrap it up, but
Yep.
Any last thoughts, Lisa or Steve?
No, I know that, thanks for pushing me into this. I know I've been sort of evading you for a while, but I owe my brother a lot because he's helped me out a lot. So it's like, yeah, okay, well, I guess. And I guess part of the reason why I was hesitant is because it's like, I'm just about done talking about it, right? So it's kind of like, but again, it's kind of, we're not done yet. So I still need to keep kind of the finger on it and, kind of that momentum going. So I'm glad you guys pushed me into this. I'd love to come back, and I
still
don't
call you a caribou lady?
Yes, they still call me the caribou lady. And they, you brought up, what's his name? Todd. Sorry, I missed it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Todd Miller.
So I watched that one, and I'm thinking, I think David and you and I talked about it, and it's like, I'd love to have a conversation with him. It's a totally different sort of similar, a lot of what he was saying was actually similar. So, and I'd love to come back and talk one point, about northern corridors and rail to Alaska and, economic development or, something more fun maybe than caribou. Yeah. Yeah. So.
Well,
Yes,
thank you,
thank
Lisa.
you. Thank you guys for inviting me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to hide you from our screen up here. Just be aware that we'll still hear you, so you might want to mute. And then Steve and I are going to just reflect on the conversation that we've just had with Lisa. So, I'll be talking with you very soon. Of course, we've got some work together, and I look forward to that. Thanks, Lisa.
All right.
Good night.
All right, you guys take care. Good night.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, that was fun. It was fun.
I was thinking how Brian Hyde, in one of our very first streams, our second, wasn't he? He was our second stream. And he just talked about how important it is to act locally, like do what you can personally for your family, for your community, and get engaged. Lisa's been doing that for all of her adult life, in particular since moving to the far north. And so I've visited Zama a few times, and I've lived in northern Alberta for 5.5 years, and so I've seen the area both on land and from the air and on a skidoo, and I've met most of the people. I've met a lot of the people in her region. Everyone cares about each other, but also the region. Like when you end up in the north doing a job that's of some importance, it's hard not to feel connected because of the isolation in part, and because it's such a unique place. And so it doesn't surprise me that my sister would get involved in public life, because if she didn't, well, there's just so few others that would. So
Yeah.
everyone has to sort of step up and take and grab the rope and pull on it.
Well, and when, I mean, it's sad that more people wouldn't jump in and be a part of the community, and take their turn being a part of the community politically.
Do you mean sad
Like,
where? In her region, or just generally?
well, no, I more generally,
Okay.
it's just, I mean, because I think when everybody has a turn to have some responsibility in that respect, it builds that sense of community. I was just imagining, I'm like, she said, so on one side of Highway 35, you absolutely do not hunt buffalo. If the buffalo crosses Highway 35 and they get into a different range, now there's a chance of actually undoing some of the good work that's been done. And so now it sort of becomes your responsibility to make sure that those buffaloes are called out of the herd, and that bison, groups can't
Yeah, and
touch.
that's
And
precisely
it's
the
like,
kind of nuance that's missing from the bureaucrat computer modeling. You know,
right, right. And those people that would say, I don't hunt them over there, but I certainly hunt them over there, they're doing that because they understand what's at stake locally. That's
yeah,
not because there's a federal gun to their head or a provincial gun to their head or any gun to their head in the
yeah,
form of any type of legislation or law. Whether those laws exist or not, they're doing that because it's part of the community. And they would be
yeah.
ostracized by the community if they didn't toe the line on that, because all the local stakeholders there understand how important it is. And and that,
So
that's 35,000 people in the size of 3 or 4 New England states. Now, when you go to New York City and you take 100 or 1,000 times that many people and squeeze them into a football field or whatever, the dynamics necessarily change, and there can't be that same sense of community, but something similar can still happen in households and on blocks. And I mean, it just, we've got this idea, or we've migrated in society to this idea that if something's going to get done, it has to be done by the government with a law or legislation or requirements or procedures. And so many things can get done so effectively just by cooperating with our neighbors,
with information. So as you've been talking here, I've been
with good
thinking.
information. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I one of the things I've been learning through all of our conversations together and with our guests is that I'm likely to vote the rest of my life for smaller government, and that government has a tendency to step in with really blunt instruments, and with maybe good intention, they create all kinds of unintended consequences. And
Yeah.
yet we have to look back and think, well, maybe years ago industry didn't care about the caribou, or people were over hunting it and they were just irresponsible, and because the data we see now is that the caribou was at risk, or is at risk, that the numbers are low. Well, how did the numbers get so low? It must be that people were poaching, or the industry was clearing the land, or whatever. Actually, it's probably more true that they just didn't measure it or know. The data wasn't available for people in that, let's say 50 years ago or 70 years ago, to know that they were hunting this species to a point of risk, or that they were affecting the land base to a point that was putting this species at risk. But now that we know, clearly people that live in the area want to turn that around. So perhaps if government has done any good in this circumstance, it's that they've made some data available.
I guess
Maybe that's a place for government to actually provide some metrics for the basic resources and species on the land, and then partner with industries, partner with local community groups to help make sure that these numbers are effectively balanced. But otherwise, to stay out of the way. Provide good information, and people will want to collect together, cooperate, and do good things.
I think that's true, but sometimes I ask myself, would there still be sweatshops today, with 8 to 12-year-old kids making garments in New York City? Would that exist today? And does it only not exist because there was a rule or a law enacted to stop it? Would there still be industries just pumping horrible chemicals, raw chemicals, into pristine streams all over this country if the Environmental Protection Agency hadn't been created and legislation to stop it? Like, would go back further, would there still be plantations with African American slaves on them picking cotton today if Abraham Lincoln hadn't, given the Emancipation Proclamation? Like, would that still be happening except for government? And it's like, there's so much about just the societal evolution that happens anyway, and I'm not sure how much faster that happens because legislation, or because it gets legislated into happening. And there are cases, I would say, there are certainly instances, but
we could, however, draw a distinction between government setting a regulation and government enacting a plan to meet that regulation.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, what we're seeing in Lisa's region. So first of all, the regulation is kind of weird, that, this 65% undisturbed land area goal. But let's imagine for a moment that people negotiate around that and figure out a better metric. Like maybe, like Lisa was saying, the number of caribou. Maybe that's a better metric. And if we all agree that that's a pretty good metric to study, then, and if the goal is to help that number to grow, great. If government says that number needs to grow, but otherwise stay out of the way, it sounds like that's a community that's ready to take on that responsibility. But government might come in with a plan, and that plan lacks nuance and it lacks local consideration. So I agree with you that some of these
it's not very different than
may not have
not very different than the government saying, like, what if the government just said right now, we feel we need 75% vaccination penetration in the population in order to achieve herd immunity with COVID, and right now we're at 40.
Well, let's negotiate the metric.
Public, here's what we think, and here's the science behind it, why we think that, and here's where we are. So everybody just needs to do what they need to do. Like, how much quicker would we get there?
The first feedback loop must be, are we looking at the right measurement? Do we have the right measuring stick? And that we have to have a feedback loop around that. Like this edict you've just described is exactly what Ontario is doing. We've got to have 75% vaccination before we're going to open up the businesses. Like, it's absolutely absurd.
But rather than a voluntary goal, here's what some scientists are saying, et cetera, and this is kind of the goal. Looks like I lost you there. Wiped out.
Oh, there we go. Okay. I think our
We
our
must
internet
be needing
connection
to
is
wrap up. I think my
yeah,
phone's dying.
it's trying to tell us something. It sounds like this conversation could carry on, but that just
Yep.
means that we haven't had a conversation in a long time. So
Nope,
it's been
that's
3
true.
weeks, hasn't it? And you've been like to Florida and back, and you've been living your life normally, and I've been in Ontario where we're still under house arrest, essentially. So we should have another conversation soon.
Yeah, let's do that. Well, thank you, David.
Thank you, Steve.
And thank you, everyone watching. Appreciate your participation.